Okay, so this class is on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it is the first novel that Lewis wrote in the Narnia Chronicles, although in terms of its placement within the whole series, after they've all been written, it will fall as the second novel. But as I say, it's the first one that he wrote, and also the most popular and famous of the whole series. And if you've not read the entirety of the Narnia Chronicles, you still might have read this one, and it was the first one that's put into film. It's actually almost always the one that's put into adaptations in film and TV and so forth. It is a portal fantasy novel. Again, it uses a entry point into a whole world, and those entry points, I suggested last class, are helpful ways for Lewis to suggest, I think, that perspective, it matters in terms of how we see things. So in a sense, and this could give rise to the charge of perspectivalism and relativism. Is this just a Christian way of looking at reality, or is this reality? But he needs to introduce the idea of perspectivalism because he's dealing with contemporaries who don't recognize, when I say contemporaries, in the scientific community, they think that science is a perspective without perspective, and they don't recognize how science has changed over the course of time. And the illustration of that was in the discarded image, the previous image of which had been a scientific view, and it was replaced by another scientific view. And both of them have things about the viewpoint that recommends them, and both of them have things about them that are problematic. And that goes also for our contemporaries and their way of looking at the world around them. He will say that it will have things that recommend it, but it will also be needs to be recognized as a theory, a way of looking at things that helps us to understand things or doesn't. And when he says understand things, or when I say understand things, he means the whole of life experience, not just in a materialist fashion. That's the scientific method that looks at matter through the experimental method, using, the whole procedure that you're taught in high school science, of having a limited experiments that you can verify in under certain laboratory conditions, etc., and then you can prove or disprove certain things, and on the basis of that you can start to draw larger conclusions. That's a method, but the method is not anything other than a way of getting rid of human experience outside of those particular conditions. But the broad nature of human experience, from birth to death and considerations of the afterlife, are left outside the consideration. And so he just wants us to observe that the scientific method is not science. And it, in a sense, it cuts out the most important parts of human life, at least historically speaking. It rejects, apparently, and he's proven this in The Abolition of Man, it rejects the Tao, the moral law, which, if you look at the whole of human history and its major religions, there's a pretty much of a consensus among the peoples of the earth throughout human history that the Tao is objectively verifiable and, in that sense, scientific. It's not that it can't be disputed, but it's disputed within the Tao, because we'll say this is right or wrong, and it has consequences. And we'll use morally charged statements and say it's wrong. Wrong not in a scientific sense, but wrong in the implications of this we don't like. It's good or evil. So that's what he's at pains to show, and he wants to say that that is embedded in the education system even now, that we have excluded considerations of goodness and beauty as part of education, and we think that that is being scientific. It's a sort of a they don't recognize that it's a method that they're teaching. They think that it is the thing. So it's a theory about theories. And he says the theory is not very scientific, actually. That's his main problem. And that's going to be threaded throughout the Narnia Chronicles. So last time I talked about the magician's nephew and observed how Uncle Andrew was a sort of a scientist who was willing to experiment on other things, first of all the guinea pig, but then even the children, and seemed to see that he was exempt from the Tao. He thought by dint of the fact that he was a scientist, the petty considerations of whether it was right or wrong should not apply to him. And Uncle Andrew, in that sense, represents the modern educator who is a conditioner and is willing to do things to his subjects which he would never do to himself. And that's demonstrated by Uncle Andrew in his actions there. And he's a bit of a comic figure, a figure of ridicule, and, you know, suitable for a children's novel, isn't presented as diabolical. That will come later in Lewis's sci-fi trilogy. Then he will talk about demonic forces, that it will be appropriate to that genre of fiction. But for children's literature, I don't think Uncle Andrew is portrayed as a monster, as a satanic figure. But I think that there is something of Satanism in Uncle Andrew's endeavor, and Lewis thinks so. Because literally, human beings are being considered as something other than image bearers of God. So this novel, the first one, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is set in the land of Narnia, which is a land of talking animals, as we know, and mythical creatures, and it's ruled by an evil white witch. Now, is the evil white witch the same here as was that in The Magician's Nephew? No, it's not. It seems, you wonder if it might be, because they're both female, and they both are clearly superhuman, and they're both evil. And so you might conclude that Jadis is the White Witch, but I don't think there's anything that can connect those two figures, other than the fact that they're female, supernatural, and wicked, and oppose Aslan, and oppose the Tao, and want dominance, and are willing to use their magic to that end. So in that sense, there's an analogy at least being drawn between Uncle Andrew and Jadis, and also the White Witch. There's a similarity of methodology. Even though Uncle Andrew, the pathetic Uncle Andrew, has nothing like the awareness or the degree of malice that both the witch and Jadis have. There's nothing like that. They're presented as pathetic. And in that sense, Lewis is, to some degree, letting his colleagues in the scientific fields off the hook, saying they're oblivious to the fact that they're doing things that are diabolical. But they're still diabolical. So they're effectively the servants of powers of which they don't even acknowledge. But they're still there. So it's a frame in terms of the structure. The type of novel this is a framework. It's a frame story. So it begins in a certain context, and it will conclude in that context as well. And in between, you go in through the wardrobe into another realm. And as we've seen from the last novel, that other realm is one of many possible realms, because there's the pools in the midst of the wood between the worlds, and you could go into through multiple pools, and they would go across space and time in different ways. You could end up in Charn, or you could end up in Narnia. That's just one of many possible worlds. So I said to you last time, we need to see this, although Lewis is not at pains to flesh this out entirely, but it's more than Ptolemaic discarded image cosmology is superior to contemporary cosmology. It's not that simple as this compared to that. He's suggesting that all of them are provisional models. And so he introduces the idea of the multiverse, which is very popular in our day. And as I said, I don't see many contemporary critics acknowledging the multiverse aspect of Lewis's fiction. And that's partly because he doesn't flesh it out, but it is still there. So it's not just Narnia. There are other worlds that in the Magician's Nephew, he brings to our attention. And then he'll do more of that when he comes to the sci-fi trilogy. So there's another depth to the whole narrative that I think is often being discounted. But it's, as I say, it's a frame story, and we have 4 children who are relocated in its wartime, Second World War. Remember, Lewis writes this in 1950, so the war's over, but he puts the setting during the Second World War. London is being bombed, the Blitz is happening. That's the very time when Lewis is delivering his wartime broadcasts, which eventually get written up as Mere Christianity. And he went into London to the BBC headquarters, even though it was being bombed and was being actually targeted by the Nazis during that time. You have to remember that. This is not just something that he did. It was an act of courage to go into the midst of the place that most people are leaving for the sake of protecting themselves. Here's a man going into a place where the enemies of his country are seeking, like the BBC is the sort of the communications headquarters of the whole country, and he's going, and it's the prime target for the Nazi bombs. And he goes and delivers these things. The children, on the other hand, because their parents care for them, have been removed from the city to the outskirts and to an old country estate. And the youngest, who is the main character here, his name is Lucy. We know about that already. And interestingly, she seems to be the most spiritually perceptive of all the characters. Even though she's the youngest, she is, in some sense, the leader in seeing something that's true. And so Lewis might be leaning on what it says in scriptures about the children. Let the little children come unto me. And the way that the children receive the kingdom of God and receive Christ at a young age in a way that contradicts the way we think about wisdom and knowledge, which we associate with those who are the wisest and the oldest and the most experienced. That's not how it works in the kingdom of God. God purposefully shames the wise and the knowledgeable and the professors and even the religious establishment by the way he works. It's not accidental. It's purposefully contradicting the way the world and its knowledge systems operate. And again, so Lewis uses that here in portraying Lucy as the central character, and she enters through the famous wardrobe into this realm of Narnia. Now, she does it 3 times. First, they're just playing a little game. She goes into the wardrobe, closes the door. Everyone knows you're not supposed to close the door. And yet she does. And when she does, she feels the fur coats that are in the wardrobe and then pushes her way through it and then feels cold air and starts walking. Comes back, comes out of the wardrobe, and she thinks she's been away for hours. Her siblings think that she just left and are wondering why she's concocting this story, very detailed story about her experiences there. And I think she's just being imaginative and making it all up. And at first they play along with it, but eventually said, okay, enough of this silliness. And one of them, Edmund, is particularly nasty to her. And Lewis is going to talk about that. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Edmund's response there to her and why it's important in the context of what I've just said about education. Because Lewis specifically talks in the novel about how Edmund had become like this as a result of his time in school. Peter comments on it. The fact that his younger brother had become beastly. He learned to be like that when he was in school. What sort of school? Well, he was sent to a public school. when I say public school, a very private elite school where you are in boarding school. The Pevensey children have been sent by their parents to private education where they have been subjected to what the ruling class in Britain is, and Lewis himself was subjected to a sort of conditioning that's marked by a lot of brutal experience. And in general, there were the kids that were good at sports, and then there were the kids like Lewis. A little war that was going on between them. Lewis was no good at sports, but Lewis was very good academically, very strong, and he had contempt for the sporty types, and vice versa. They had contempt for him as well. The difference between them is that they would beat him. Like physically, there's the bullying that is going on in schools. Lewis presents that in his fiction as well. But in general, the problem of the schools is not only the rivalry between little different crowds or groups or cliques within the school. The problem is that all of them are taught in a manner that suggests that the Tao doesn't apply. And he's particularly going to get into that in a later novel. He'll get it into Silver Chair. He'll talk about it in Prince Caspian. He'll talk about that particular, the experience. It's not so prominent here, but I just want to note to you that Edmund, the reason why he treats Lucy as badly as he does is he's been created to be a man without a chest. And his appetites have taken over and they rule him. And that's why he wants the Turkish delight. He lusts after it, but there's nothing that will govern him and say this is wrong and will stop him from doing evil things. He's even willing to sacrifice his brothers and sisters. Right? Peter, he wants to get back at him because there's a perceived slight. And his sisters, I don't care. I just want more of the Turkish delight, and I want more of, he fantasizes that he's going to marry the White Witch in the same way Uncle Andrew does. And so we see a mini Uncle Andrew in Edmund. That's what we have here. And that's interesting. If you see the two and the comparison and the way they relate to this female, beautiful, supernatural character, we have two men without chests. One who's just young and one who's older, obviously. But it's the same thing. We have two individuals who've been taught that the Tao does not apply, and they can therefore do whatever they wish in that situation. And what they wish happens to be to go along with very evil agendas. And so Lewis is making a comment again about the effect of a type of education and how it creates a certain type of character who is able to do very wicked things without actually being aware that what they're doing is very wicked. But it's central to the story here. It's not just that Lucy goes into the wardrobe and perceives the truth of Narnia and the importance of Aslan. I'll get to that later on. But also that her youngest brother is particularly nasty and results in a betrayal, a treachery, an act of treachery towards his own siblings, which Aslan will have to rectify. But it's important we recognize not only that Edmund is the betrayer, but that he represents a boy without a chest that has been created by the education system. So Lewis is exemplifying here in his first novel, in the Narnia Chronicles, what he's already argued in The Abolition of Man. Most people don't draw the connection there, but it's obvious. Right? So when so that Lucy goes, as I say, 3 times via the magic of a wardrobe into a spare room. The wardrobe was cut from the tree in Narnia where the seed was planted, right? And the lamppost was taken from the white, not the White Witch, from Jadis, which she swung and tried to put people, and it got planted there, and it became this tree in the midst of Narnia. So that previous story leads into this story, right? That the wardrobe was cut down from the tree that was in the midst of the Garden of Eden, as it were, or the correspondence to that. And when Lucy goes through the first time, she comes back, tells her siblings, they dispute that this is what happened. Edmund in particular is nasty towards her, but Edmund follows her in the second time, sees that it's real, can't dispute it, and yet when he comes back the second time, he lies. Says it didn't happen. But the reason he does is because the witch has given him something that he lusts after. And now it is lusts after, and that whatever the Turkish delight represents. It's, it's a tasty, sweet treat. But it seems to represent more than that, and he can't get enough of it. He wants more, and she uses his passions, his lusts, to lead him to do even more wicked things. I want you to go back. No, you can't have any more of that. You have to go and get the other 3 children and come back and bring them to me, and then I'll give you more. And he's willing to do this, to betray, like a Judas, his siblings. Now, the reason why the White Witch wants this is because there's apparently a prophecy about 4 children that will enter from another world into the land of Narnia. And that prophecy will relate to the story that we heard about in The Magician's Nephew already. Right? So there's an interlocking story. Now, so when Edmund goes back, lies about what he's experienced, and brings his siblings in to him, then we have the third entrance into the land. And at that point, all 4 of the children are brought in. Now we see different agendas at play. The White Witch is trying to destroy the 4 children, because the 4 children are going to destroy her. They have no idea that they have any role or function in any story, let alone their own story. Their own story is that they're 4 children in World War II Britain that are alienated from their parents to some degree. And their parents are nowhere to be found. There's no one to guide them, other than the man that they meet in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, their uncle, whatever the relation is, who just happens to have some knowledge of the story. And this is one of the questions that is raised when they question whether Lucy was lying or not. He just basically says, let's follow a logical argument here. Is this possible? Now, he knows the truth here, but he's not going to say it is so. He gets them to think about the facts and the elements of experience and say, is it characteristic of Lucy to lie? No, she never lies. Would Edmund lie? Oh, yes, he does lie. Okay, as far as this is possible, yes, it's not a normal experience, but is it possible given all the facts that you know? Yes, it is. Well, then he says, then it could be. Now, he knows that it is, but he doesn't say it is. He says it could be. Now, all he's doing there is doing something like an apologetic. That's what he's doing. Just opening you to the possibility. Will you consider this even? But he uses logic to do it. Okay, so he's modeling the very thing that Lewis himself is alleged to have abandoned when he stopped defending the Christian faith of the Socratic Club. But there you go. It's right in the first novel that he writes. Do you have a question or comment? Or
I did have a little bit one. I'm just curious about the incident where Edmund lies after going to Narnia for the first time.
Okay.
If Lewis is trying to make a certain comment from that, or it's just develop his character more so. Like, I don't know, it just seems like I always read that as kind of odd.
Odd that he lies?
Like, it's to his character, it does, but it does, like, logically, it doesn't make sense why he would lie.
Oh, because he's one. Because why would Edmund lie? One, because he's a sinner like all the others, right? So that's clear. That's why he would. The conditions are there, but also there's the schooling has not presented right and wrong as objectively morally real things. He doesn't think that they are, and so because of this, his passions. So there are different parts of the soul. You've got your head, you've got your chest, you've got your passions. And Lewis has talked with a man without chest. We have a boy without a chest. He's still a boy, but he has no chest. And so his passions overrule his head here. Who be motivated?
Wouldn't Edmund be motivated to get everyone into the wardrobe?
Perhaps he just didn't help them.
Oh, at first?
Well, he did his first trip there, right?
Yeah. Just following Lucy, doesn't believe it, but
follows Lucy, but he encounters the White Witch on his first trip.
Yes, but she sends him back.
She sends him back to bring them in. So shouldn't he, by this point, have the motivation to bring his siblings and all of them into the wardrobe? And so why would he lie about the fact that he went to the wardrobe or that there wasn't the world if he has the motivation from the start for us to get more Turkish delight?
I'm not sure he has the motivation from the start. I think sin makes you do things that you're not oblivious to some degree, and after you do it, then you get another. Like, he doesn't have a full-blown plan from the beginning. Over the course of time, he does things that are going to allow him to continue to do what he's already done and to cover it up. And he's sort of, the cover up is an interesting thing. So he doesn't acknowledge the Tao, but he also to some degree doesn't want to be embarrassed by the ill deeds. It's not just that he's trying to keep them from being onto them. He feels guilty about it in some small way. I think that's part of the story there. I mean, it's psychologically acute. Like, people don't admit what's motivating them is evil, because if they did, then it might actually rectify. They might say, hold on, that's what I'm doing here is wrong. It doesn't seem to occur to him until he meets Aslan. And that also is interesting. But Aslan is less harsh on him than we are as well. And he's not going to say that Edmund's not guilty, but he is going to say, I came for the purpose of pardoning guilty individuals. And Edmund's just one of them, but actually it's for all of you. It's just that he's the one we dislike. But from Aslan's perspective, it seems to apply to all of the children. Because that's the way the way we can see Edmund as contemptible is because he's different than the other kids. And Aslan, however, doesn't just die for his sin, but seems to die for all of their transgressions. That's the implication of this, although it's specifically connected with that particular act, right? But it seems to have an inclusive application and power. And that's the way Lewis, but that's the way that Lewis gets us to hate Edmund is we don't associate ourselves with Edmund. Oh, he's that type of kid. I hate that type of kid. You remember those types of kids in school that used to rat you out to the teachers? And they themselves were the worst and least well-liked of all of the kids, and yet they seemed to wheedle their way into the teacher's affections, and they would conceal the truth. That sort of kid, we recognize that kid. What we don't recognize is that we ourselves have the capacity to do what that type of kid does under the right conditions. And if we have the Tao, then we're less likely to do it. We're resistant to it to some degree, but that doesn't mean that we ultimately don't do it. And the fact that we even desire to do it shows how sinful the human heart is. But that gets into Christian theology there. And that's not really being explicitly represented throughout the whole story there, but it's implicit in the sacrifice that happens there. So when in Narnia the siblings come into the wardrobe in the third iteration, an old prophecy seems to be fulfilled. And that's an interesting thing. And I think that adds a depth to the story, and it's the sort of thing that Tolkien does in The Lord of the Rings all the time. So here we have a story of characters that we've just met who are seemingly characters who are mythical, fabled characters about whom other people have spoken for a very long time and have done legendary things. And yet they're not legendary. They're real in the sense they're right in front of us. And their choices seem like the choices of children. They don't seem of momentous import. They seem to be small things. But if you use an analogous type of reading practice, which Lewis is always encouraging, the application to the reader is obvious. The child does small childish things that uphold what's good and right and true, or the child contradicts them, just like the children reading the books can. And is it possible that what we're doing in our daily lives has sort of a legendary importance? Like, could it be that significance? In The Weight of Glory, he says that there is no such thing as an ordinary person. You'll never meet one. Because God created that person in his image. That individual has a relation to God, and it's an eternal one. They were created for glory by the King of Glory. They've been created for that. And so if you think that they are merely a person that's beside you in the classroom or on the public transportation or in your house, you're not seeing things rightly. You need to see with different eyes. You need to go through the frame narrative that Lewis is providing here, and you need to apply this to yourself. And that's what makes the story meaningful. It seems to have it doesn't seem to. The analogy is clear to the reader that their lives are more important than they seem to be. Remember, the 20th century is the century where the worst atrocities against mankind have taken place during 2 world wars, and the whole scientific, technocratic education system, which suggests that we have no souls, no moral nature, and that's presented through education. And Lewis it results in a life of meaningless. Viktor Frankl, I don't know if you've read Viktor Frankl, heard of Viktor Frankl, Jewish psychologist caught by the Nazis, loses his wife, family, portrays the whole awful conditions of the concentration camp, comes out talking about how those that survived did so because they had a sense of the meaning of life, that there was meaning even in this apparently brutal, meaningless action. There was yet meaning to life. They held on to that. And so he writes a book called Man's Quest for Meaning. Lewis is writing against the same nihilistic tendency of the education system and of life around him, but he's trying to say there is meaning to your life, you readers. It's not because he's a great fiction writer, although I think he's actually much better than he's reputed to be as a writer. But it's that he's able to convey that same sense of meaning and purpose to children. And children like that. It gives them a sense of importance to themselves that is being disregarded by the adults around them, who treat them just like, not like people. Like inconveniences, they send them off to the boarding schools where they are brutalized. Lewis hated his school upbringing. He absolutely hated it. And he resented his father for it. He begged his father to bring him back. His father couldn't handle it. He needed somebody to help him. After his wife died, he needed somebody to take care of the education for him. And he thought he was giving his son the best education he could get for him. Genuinely did. Loved his sons. But Lewis hated the education, and so did his brother. And so did the other writers of his day who had the same education, George Orwell. And Orwell came out a socialist because he so hated the aristocratic public school education system that he'd been subjected to, became a socialist against that elite. Lewis went through the same education, was just as cynical about it, but he ended up defending the life of freedom and virtue that the school system actually contradicted. And he found it in the stories that he read. So it wasn't in the school, it wasn't in the teachers, it wasn't in the Tao that they represented, it was in the stories that they read that spoke of a better education, and he got that education by reading those books. And that's what he's doing by giving us this book, is by giving us a story that's better than the world around them. You can call it escapism. He would say probably it's not escapism, it's seeing reality as it really is, not according to the propagandists and not according to our experience of what happens when the propagandists are at work. He'll spend a lot more time on this in the Silver Chair. I'll get to that. There, he really goes after the education system. And it's moonshine and it's deception. And it happens in the underland and all that stuff. But here he at least touches on it, and it gives importance to these children that seems almost ridiculous, actually. So they go into a wardrobe. They say there's a white witch, there's a lion, and at the end of it all, we see them as adults, and they've got crowns on. They're coronated, the kings and queens of Narnia, for doing what? Like, they're given magical implements, they are involved in the battle and so forth, all that, and they are crowned at the end. Well, Lewis is tapping into Christian theology in the representation of in the book of Revelation, that we are co-regents with God. Christ is presented as prophet, priest, and king in Scripture. The so-called Munis triplex. You ever heard of this doctrine? If not, look it up. This is the threefold office of Christ: prophet, priest, and king. Most strongly presented in the book of Hebrews. But he's got three aspects of his ministry, three offices, as it were. Jesus is our effectual prophet. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords, and he is the great high priest that makes the sacrificial system of the temple obsolete because it's been fulfilled. He is the sacrifice. He's the high priest. He provides atonement. All sorts of different functions are being fulfilled by Christ. And he is the King of kings, and he gives crowns to those who bear his image and who place faith in him, just like these four children. So these four children represent Christianity. All Christians are represented by these little children. Those who read this story have no idea that this is at stake here, by the way, but they like it. I get to be the hero of the story at the end for what Aslan did. I like that story. And the children at the end of the story, by the way, are presented as virtuous knights and ladies. They speak with very powerful speeches. Their diction is exalted. And in terms of their appearance, they're beautiful and noble. And at the beginning, they're nothing like that. They're just embryonic there. And even Edmund the Traitor is rebranded. What's his new appellation? Edmund the Just. How on earth is he just? You ever thought about that? Why is Edmund just? What's the just thing that Edmund does in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? I don't know what it is. I don't see any. So it's not what he did, it's what Aslan calls him. He's been justified. He's now just. It's what he did that makes Edmund just. Wholly related to what Aslan does and nothing to do with what Edmund does. All Edmund does is betray his siblings and the whole land of Narnia. He's a traitor. Everyone regards him as such, for which reason the prophecy, long pronounced, is going to be fulfilled. And what does he do? Well, he actually professes faith in Aslan. He has a little private conversation with Aslan and then walks away from him, and Aslan pronounce him that everything's right between the two of them. And that's it. And everyone else is like, what? They're angry at Aslan that this traitor is not only being not treated as he deserves, but seemingly is going to be exalted as one of the heroes of Narnia. He's going to be given a crown. I mean, we focus on Lucy, but the most fascinating character of the Narnia Chronicles is actually Edmund. Most representative. So there's a lot of complexity going on there because Peter becomes the most important figure among the children. He's the eldest. He slays the wolf. He has to lead the charge. He's the valiant. He represents a certain type of virtue. We admire him. And yet each of the children seems to represent something about human nature which is being commended to us. And the most difficult one is of Susan. We'll come to Susan later. Say more about that, because when it comes to the last battle, there's that problematic episode. What happened to Susan? What's going on there? I'm not going to get into that now because it will take us out of order on this, and it'll go down route I don't want to go into here. But Lewis wrote this book for his goddaughter, Lucy Barfield, Owen Barfield's child. And Barfield is a friend of Lewis. He's a teacher. He's an advisor. He's even a trustee eventually of his estate. And the book becomes rightly famous in part because of the way it tells this grand narrative, which really exemplifies Christian teaching in one novel. I mean, more strongly than all the others. It seems to have a comprehensive worldview, if you will. It's hard for me to say I like it the best because I like so many of them well. I don't want to dispense with any of them. I don't even want to rank them, but this is the one that people know from the Narnia Chronicles for good reason. It seems to hit all the right keys, and it's the first one. So if it's that good, where do you go for an encore? Well, but he does come up with one. And what he does here, and I think this, I haven't said this yet, Max Weber, the famous sociologist, talks about the Protestant work ethic. You know Max Weber? Have you heard of him? You've heard of Max Weber at least. No? Famous German sociologist, 20th century. He's the one who talks about the Protestant work ethic, which you've heard about before probably. But he also talks about the growing disenchantment of the world as a characteristic of modern life. So when Lewis talks in De Descriptione Temporum about the modern age being one in which the Tao is rejected and Christianity with it, and we're effectively post-Christian, Weber talks about one of the further implications of that, namely that the world is disenchanted. It is a non-spiritual world now that we seem to see ourselves in. We reject the very idea of a spiritual reality in the midst of a material world, which before us, every pagan and Christian would have acknowledged as just impossible not to hold. But modern man seems incapable. He's wholly rejected, not just the discarded image then, but the idea that there's a spiritual reality behind, alongside, I don't know how you want to present it, in the midst of the world that modern sciences recognize, the material. So Max Weber calls it the disenchantment of the world, and Lewis's fiction is trying to reverse that. It's trying to re-enchant, and Tolkien's as much so. It's re-enchanting the world, helping us to see through the eyes of a different type of man, which both Lewis and Tolkien are. These are men who recognize a spiritual reality around them at all times, even in the midst of the 20th century, the most brutal and materialist and nihilist age that there has ever been in the whole history of the human race. They say there is an ongoing spiritual reality that remains true, even if all of us, all the intellectuals around us deny that it's there. And so there's really interesting, if you look at the 1940s, there's a real resurgence of Christian conviction being expressed by writers of fiction, from Dorothy Sayre through C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Owen Barfield and many others, but many represented by the Inklings, that is really responding to the same conditions that their contemporaries are, but their contemporaries are the ones that are regarded as important, like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, but all the nihilists of the 20th century, they're the ones you read in schools. You read their books. You don't read Lewis. You don't read Tolkien. You don't read Dorothy Sayre. You don't take them even seriously as fiction writers. When I say you don't, I mean the schools have taught you to disregard them as important. I don't think I'm going on a limb here. If you didn't go to a Christian school, you would never have read these books in school, I don't think. But you will have read them on the side and be very interested in them. But you will regard it as a non-serious fiction. You think, well, what is this? If it's fiction, then how can we reject it as fiction? Like if you admit that Huxley's writing fiction and Orwell's writing fiction and Lewis is writing fiction and Tolkien is writing fiction, why can we not take fictional portraits that contradict the contemporary worldview seriously, but those that uphold it, take them seriously? How is that so? I think, again, because whatever the merits of Orwell and Huxley, they don't see with spiritual insight at all. And that is the one thing that the public school system doesn't want to acknowledge, that there is such a thing. And both Lewis and Tolkien make it clear that not only did they believe it, but you believe it as well, you the reader. And the reason we can see that is because you love these books more than the other books. You know that it's true. You not only want it to be true, you think it is true. And your feelings on this are truer than the critics' schooled anti-spiritual vision for life. So I think he is trying to weave a spell. So in the way, I'm going to read this at the end of the whole course, The Weight of Glory, or get you to read it. In The Weight of Glory, towards the end of this, that essay, he speaks of casting a spell on his audience. I'll just read the passage. He says, "Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell by talking about the weight of glory that presses on us, even at this time in the midst of war, and suggests a more significant purpose of the meaning of every individual life? Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell?" And he says, "Perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them." And remember that. They're also used for breaking enchantment. What's the enchantment of the disenchanted age that Weber talked about? Lewis is providing the counterspell. And it's not for casting an enchantment, it's for breaking the enchantment. And the enchantment is that of atheist materialism. That's the enchantment. You're under a spell, just like the White Witch will use in The Silver Chair. It's a spell that makes us think that the spiritual reality isn't there. I'm going to cast a counterspell through my fiction. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them, and you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Note he says nearly 100 years. So he pushes it back into the 19th century, just like he did in De Descriptione Temporum, which he's not yet delivered, that lecture, when he gives the sermon, The Weight of Glory. And who laid the spell on us? The scientists and the magicians, who told us that they have the power to make heaven on earth and can give it to us. And the whole education system has been trying to teach us to deny the still shy, persistent inner voice that tells us it's not true, what they're teaching us. And what will pull them there is joy. So it's part of his own autobiography. I talked to you about this last time, Surprised by Joy. He talks about this joy that he had within him, which he read about, that Wordsworth recognized in himself as well. There was something like an ember of a fire that's gone out, and it's underneath the gray ash of life, and yet it's still there, and it can't be killed off. As much as the ash piles upon us, there's an ember that remembers the childhood experience when they believed that the world was more than was being said around them, and they lived out that reality in their little make-believe play and so forth. And some children thought that was just make-believe. But other children, and Lewis is one of them, thought that actually there's more to those imaginative exercises of youth than they make of it. There's something true in all of those stories. Now, what those stories are and how they become true then is in the myths of the ancient worlds. Lewis finds in those myths a power for joy and delight that he can't suppress. In fact, he desires it so strongly that he devotes his life to that, to study the study of literature. And it's not just to become a specialist in literature, it's because he desires the delight of the stories, so much so that he wants to spend his life reading those stories. He gets paid to talk about things he most delights in. Isn't that great? He gets paid to do that. But even as the professor of literature, employed by Oxford University, he doesn't believe those myths are true. Right? He believes they're lies breathed through silver. Remember, Dr. Davis has probably talked about this, the famous episode when he has this exchange with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, and they're talking about myths and their shared love of myths, and Norse myths in particular, but also the Greco-Roman myths, all these myths. And then they talk about the gospel accounts, which Lewis also appreciates, and says, but aren't they all just myths? And then Tolkien suggests the difference is that this is a true myth. And it just hadn't occurred to him that in any way that a myth could be true, although he wanted them to be true, so much so that he was now employed to study and teach and pursue these myths. And what he finds is that right in the center of Christianity and in the Gospels and in St. Paul and John and others, you keep getting something different than myths, something different and more mysterious. And the something that's there is the idea of the atonement. It's just over and over and over and over and over again. There are other miracles talked about in the gospel accounts, the nativity and so forth, but the universally recognized symbol of the Christian faith is the cross, right? And if you read the gospels, the emphasis is not on the birth of Jesus. In fact, Mark's gospel doesn't even tell of the birth of Jesus. He just skips it, takes him as an adult. He doesn't need to do that. There are other gospels there that will tell of that. But all of them emphasize, and 2/3 of the gospel narratives are the events leading up to his crucifixion and then the aftermath. So 2/3 of the story is talking about the death of the figure that is central to the accounts, which is a strange way to tell a biography. Like some people talk about the Gospels as biographies of Jesus, but the biographies aren't talking about his life. At least that's not the dominant emphasis. The dominant emphasis is on the significance of his death, even when he's born. That's how Mary receives him. This is the one whose death will accomplish the reversal of the curse pronounced on Adam and Eve. And he will be the figure that from ages old has been recounted as almost like a myth, the story of the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent. She knows that it's true at that point. And that something in the atonement is the idea that the death of Jesus on the cross is sacrificial, and that somehow it happens on our behalf. And therefore, and also it puts us right with God. That's also being clearly articulated in the gospel accounts. If we're in any doubt, then we'll look to the epistles and they will make it very clear. They're interpreting what happens in the gospels. And the problem for Lewis was the somehow. How, like, what do you mean we're put right with God somehow? I need to figure out the somehow. How is that event able to do this? And once he figures that out, then he removes the intellectual obstacles which he had as an educated man to receiving the Christian faith. But note that they were intellectual obstacles. He couldn't believe that it was true. He loved the story. He thought it was important and significant and powerful, although not as powerful as the death of Balder, because that had a grandeur to it, the tragic sacrifice and the imminent destruction of the whole world. There's something very romantic about that. But here there was something true in all of this. And once he figured that how it worked, he was able to embrace Christianity. Now, how did that take place? Well, it took place through this conversation he had with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. And the way that Lewis had explained it to Tolkien already is one that he got from Owen Barfield. Remember, he dedicates this work to Barfield's, his goddaughter, Barfield's daughter, that ancient languages have one word for wind, breath, and spirit. In Hebrew, ruach, in Greek, pneuma. And the original, it comprised all three at once, not separate. We've separated them. We'll distinguish the spirit from the breath and from... But for them, they are one thing represented by the Spirit of God. And in that sense, we can see the wind. Like, we can see the wind. We can't see the Spirit, but we can see the wind. But for the ancients, the Spirit and the wind are in some sense connected in a way that you can't separate them. In the same sense, the gospel accounts, when they tell about a spiritual reality, are talking about a physical, historical, lived out and experienced reality. And Lewis says, this is a different way of reading these stories. It's not just a story, it's a story of a human experience that happened in human history and transformed the world. Once he sees that, there's a sort of explanation for how it happened, although he can never articulate the exact how. He says that he's going to, but he never does. What we note in Lewis's life is that even though he never is able to articulate it, he suddenly starts going to church services. You'll say, sometime during this period I was, and Tolkien in his diaries will say the same thing. That Lewis has started, doesn't know how it's happened. He remembers the conversation in Oxford, going on a walk on Addison's walk after a meal at Magdalen. They've gone out late evening. He remembers that, but there was no conversion experience there. But that dropped, that removed the obstacle, and then eventually he believes. In the same way, we get to the true myth represented here in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So this is where I want to go with my extended digression here. The idea that Tolkien presents that myths can be true. Some myths, or one myth, is true. And the other myths that they love are echoes of that myth, pale echoes, perhaps some more fulsome than others, but they're just echoes of the one real myth. Lewis starts to inhabit Tolkien's intellectual framework then, and present his fiction in the same way. So the extent to which he makes Tolkien's ideas about myth and truth his own can be seen in the claim in one of his letters that the doctrines we get out of the true myth are, of course, less true than the actual reality. Now, the doctrines. So this will explain, perhaps, why he goes into fiction rather than defending the faith in terms of apologetics. He actually thinks if you really want to present the best apologetic, you need to experience it in some way, in the same way that he experienced it in his life. How does he portray that? Well, he portrays it in terms of these 4 little children. That's how he came to faith. They didn't accept doctrines, they accepted Aslan. It's an actual historical event. You can narrate it in a mythological form, in more truthful language than that of concepts and ideas. Philosophy deals with concepts and ideas. Very important. But they don't move you to action. They move you to acknowledge truth. Tolkien acknowledges truth, but he doesn't convert until he receives Christ as real. And how that happens, he can't explain. But it's exactly what he portrays in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at the center point. So in The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, when Aslan has been slain on the stone table of the table of the law, in fulfillment of a prophecy long given and the deeper magic, the witch didn't know, and I don't need to recapitulate the whole narrative there, but taking the place of Edmund, that of a traitor, if someone offers himself as a sacrifice in whom there's no guilt and yet willingly offers himself for it, then everything will be undone. That happened back in the novel that's not yet been written, but Lewis has in mind in The Magician's Nephew. Yes. All that will happen. And so in taking the place of Edmund, and Susan and Lucy are wandering about in the field not knowing what to do next, they hear a sudden crack behind them. Remember, they're all disconsolate. They think Aslan's been killed. They think the whole purpose of coming here has failed. And you see something of Lucy and Susan Lewis acknowledging the role of the women in the crucifixion, right? Where the apostles flee, and yet the women are moved to go back somehow. Their faith is stronger than that of the apostles, interestingly. It seems there's something that they hold on to that the men have not got. I mean, in terms of the narrative, if you present the ancient world as a very masculine way of seeing religion and women's place in it, to present women as being the first witnesses of the resurrection is literally flipping the world on its head. And they portray it that way because I'm quite convinced that that's what happened. Because again, if you're going to hold up the patriarchy, to use the feminist language, you're not going to portray the women as the first witnesses of the resurrection. You're not going to do it unless it happened, in which case it's true, in which case you better tell it. And they do. But they hear this giant crack, and it's said as if a giant had broken a giant's plate, and they see that the table's been broken in half, and Susan asks, what does it mean? And then Susan cries out, is it more magic? And then the girls hear from behind them the voice of the risen lion. Yes, it is more magic. Now, this is a magic that breaks an enchantment. No, it doesn't cause one, it breaks it. And it's the enchantment that they were under back in the world from which they came. It breaks that enchantment, not just the witches' enchantment that's led to a place in Narnia where it's always winter and never Christmas. It does that, but it's got a further consequence in that other world from which they've come as well, and it breaks that enchantment. And then he gives an explanation of sorts. If the witch had been able to look back before the dawn of time, just like Satan, if she'd been able to do that, she would have known that when a willing victim who has committed no treachery was killed in the traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. Death, where's your sting? Oh, grave, where's your victory? Just bang. But, so that's the explanation Aslan gives. What sort of explanation is that? Like, from the perspective of a narrative, it makes sense, I guess. But is it really sufficient here to cause the characters here to believe? It's a pretty shocking, sweeping claim introduced in the midst of the story for which we have no basis for believing. Remember that he hasn't yet written The Magician's Nephew even. So it's just, we just accept it as narrative truth. Okay, it's part of the story, but it seems a little bit forced here. It doesn't really hold true. But how do they respond to this mythical account that Aslan gives of the significance of his rising from death? And why would it work this way? How does the death of the willing victim take the traitor from the clutches of the witch? And how can the magic that frees the traitor be older than the magic that condemns him? Those are not answered questions, but they're presented as this is the reality. Note that Aslan's explanation is totally ignored by Susan and Lucy. They don't ask the questions I just asked. They don't say, huh? What do you mean? Older, newer magic, and the willing, like the theology that you've just presented to us, they don't get into that at all. They don't comment, they don't ask questions. What do they do? At that point, what do? They are overjoyed and they reach out and they hug him. They just embrace Aslan. In the same way that Lewis did at this point, I think. You stop asking questions. The joy overwhelms you at that point. That pulls you. And it's a joy unspeakable and full of glory that Lewis himself experienced that transformed his life. So he's leading us to a sort of apologetics that you can't really present in apologetics, but you can present in the experiences of children that he himself had experienced as an adult. And Lucy, of all of the characters, understands better than any of the others the infinite value of the presence of Aslan. All you need to do is hold on to Aslan. And so at the end of the voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Aslan tells her and Edmund that they're not going to be able to go back to Narnia, but they're going to have to stay in their home world, she weeps and says, "It isn't Narnia, it's you. We shan't meet you there. And how can we live never meeting you?" And so she's heartbroken at the fact. It's not Narnia, it's you. And how are we going to meet you there? And he doesn't answer that. But when in the last battle, when the great battle for Narnia is over, the witch is dead, Lucy tells Susan that she thinks Edmund ought to know what Aslan did for them, and at that moment they're interrupted. And if Edmund never heard the explanation, we don't learn of it. All that matters is that he has received it. Lewis doesn't even get into the explanations for how it all. What matters is Edmund accepts it. That's at the end of the day. So there's an element of, I don't want to call it blind faith, because it clearly, there are evidences for faith. There's reasons to believe. Lewis presents them in a very plausible, convincing way. But at the end of the day, the most important thing, and the one that leads all the others, is the agape love. And that one is not like any of the other loves. So this is Lewis's problem. There is no analogy for agape love. Every other form of love is not just pointing to the agape love, but is unlike agape love insofar as the loves that we love are in accordance with merit or justice, whereas this seems to be the exact opposite. In just love, we love things that are lovable. But Aslan's love is visiting us with a love that for the unlovable. And Edmund is the chief representative of that. Everyone hates him. All of the characters of Narnia call him a traitor. His siblings hate him for it. They have nothing good to say about it. Peter is disgusted by him. And yet Aslan embraces him. There's something there in that you can't explain then. The love of God can't be explained ultimately, because there's no experience you have in this world of anyone ever loving like that. No one. It doesn't exist. You only can appeal to the love of Christ to understand any of the other things. You have to first start with that. So this is why it says in 1 John 1, I think, this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and gave himself as a propitiation. So the normative love, agape love of God, is what norms everything else. And you can only receive that with joy. And once you've received it with joy, then everything else orders itself. But that's a mysterious love that it's not an intellectual one. Other than the way I've explained it to you, it's not like the others. And yet it's so powerfully true that it's represented in stories. But the stories can never get to the point of this story, because the story of the gospel doesn't present it as a story, it presents it as truth made flesh. It's a different way. It's an actual historical event. The myths of old are never presented as historical events. They're just not. They're presented as ideas. Great stories, but never presented as historical actual events in the context of a certain historical. So here's the emperor, here's the governor, here are the exact events, here are the eyewitnesses, here are the consequences. That's a historical event. That's not presented as myth at all. And yet it is presented in myth and history. Well, that combination of history, myth, and spiritual truth is a combination we see nowhere else. It's a unique genre. And Lewis, I think, is trying to present that in this book. Do you have any comments? Because I've gone specifically to this one feature there, but it seems central to it. And I wanted to, in one lecture, try and get to the essence of it. I have a couple minutes. Do you have any comments or questions? Or if not, I will get back into this. Yes?
Yeah, it's about what you're saying about the White Witch and Judas might not be the same person.
Yeah.
I found a lot of, I guess, context in the book as to why Jadis might be considered the White Witch, considering her skin turns pale after eating the apple. That would also allow her to more or less live forever. Plus, Jadis being referred to as a witch. I would just guess. I guess it was plus her being at the creation of Narnia, so she was technically there, with everything we created to with it.
Jadis was.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I was just curious where the idea that Jadis and White Witch are not the same person.
Well, why do you think that they are, other than by analogy? And you're saying there's. I said at the outset, they have these similarities. But does that make them the same being? I think it could entail that, but there's no explanation anywhere within Lewis's letters or within the story that says that Jadis is the White Witch. I don't think it. We're just assuming that it's the case, and I don't think that there's any warrant for that aside from there's a supernatural being. But I mean, it could be. I'll grant you that it's possible, but I'm not sure that it's seen. The White Witch is not called Jadis. Okay, but why is Jadis, written later, not identified with the White Witch?
She is at least called a witch.
Yes.
Not sure.
Correct.
Yeah. Perhaps maybe she becomes called the White Witch later due to her skin turning white.
Now, in the Silver Chair, the woman that we meet, or the female character that we meet there who's a witch, is that the White Witch? Is that Jadis? Or does she seem a third type of being again? To me, she seems like a third type of witch. And very similar in certain ways. Obviously. Same sort of malevolence, same sort of supernatural power, same sort of hostility to Aslan, but is it the same character? Not convinced. But he doesn't provide us a clear answer, but I think that we're concluding that because we want to see the same character. I'm not sure that it works quite that way. And then the last battle, she's not even there, which is odd. Okay. Precisely. Well, that's why I think it's not her. She actually dies in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yeah. Is it the same as Jadis? It could be, because she's not yet been killed. Right? So that would suggest that Jadis is the White Witch. But then we get in the Silver Chair another woman, female character, a witch, same sort of characteristics. In Prince Caspian, again, the same sort of character. Is it the White Witch again? I don't think so, because again, this White Witch is killed. And yet she keeps manifesting herself in female form and with the same sort of features. So is it the same one, or is it a manifestation of an antichrist type character? Yeah. Yeah, there's paleness about her. But is that not the lady in the book of Revelation? I mean, probably modeled after that, right? In the features of the, I mean, she's on a chariot drawn by what? What's pulling the chariot in? Polar bears? No. Reindeer in this one. Yeah. Yeah. And another, she doesn't have those. But again, it's because her reign is not as, like after this defeat, she's less potent seemingly, because it's not altogether winter and never Christmas. Christmas has now happened. It's been restored. The prophecy's been fulfilled. After the prophecy is fulfilled in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the other stories are going to be of lesser significance to some degree, because this is the key one. Aslan dies and is raised from it. That's going to inform the later Narnia Chronicles, but it's never as momentous as this. This is why this one is the most popular in a sense. It seems like the most important thing happens in this book. But there's still other areas that have yet to be explored as a consequence of this. And one of the things he wants to show is the children growing older and what happens in relation to this. So what happens is they get older in years. How will they receive this? Will they, and how will they act going back to the land of Earth, Second World War, public schools? How will they behave knowing what happened in Narnia? What will the kids be like? What will Edmund be like when he goes back after this story? He wants to explore that. We find out that actually Edmund is a different boy than he was before. He'll meet other children and he'll invite them to Narnia as well. So there's an evangelistic component. There's a witness component to it. Other children will also come into the kingdom of Narnia through it. All sorts of things being played out there. Yes?
What do you think about the parallel of when they found Jadis and Char? That the whole court is people frozen. And then when Edmund first comes to the White Witch's castle, it's all the creatures of Narnia have been frozen.
It's funny because it's not, you're right. So that's great. So in Charn, there's people that like the unspeakable word, which she's spoken now, kills her whole world. It's a terrible spell, which she seems to regret having spoken, but still has done it, and it's done. And so now we have these frozen characters. But is this Charn, the frozen palace, or is it just sort of a representation of it, like statues of that original world? That's how it seems to me. I don't think we're there in the midst of Charn in the palace where the White Witch is. That's not Charn. But it seems to be like characters that are frozen in time that seem to represent that. And then they thaw out and come to light. Well, that's again this sort of a pictorial representation of the undoing of death, which Aslan speaks of. So now what's going to happen is all that was happen is going to become untrue. And we're going to work backwards and read history differently then. There's a sort of a hermeneutic for reading history at that point. So yes, this happened in the world, but if we see it through the eyes of faith, how do we actually read history? That's in there. Anyway, I think I've run out of time. I know I've run out of time. Thank you. I don't know.